So here's the truth. Medical school didn't teach me how to be a doctor. I attended lectures, went on hospital placements and sat exams, but it wasn't until I graduated and started my first job as a newly qualified doctor on the surgical wards that I really learned what medicine was all about. Conventional ways of learning like lectures, textbooks and homework assignments teach facts and concepts, but not necessarily how to apply them in the real world. The best way to learn is to learn by doing. It's active, it's reflective, it's personal, it's memorable, and I've learned things faster and more effectively by ditching the theory and learning from real-world experiences. But we all have lots and lots of real-world experiences. So what is the best way to learn from these experiences? Well, today I wanted to dive into one of the most influential psychological models of learning out there, experiential learning theory, and look at how the principles behind different experience-based learning theories have helped me to learn faster and more effectively. I'll also be diving into the different preferences of experiential learning towards the end of the video too. So hit that subscribe button and let's get going. So let me start by asking you a question. Have you ever had a really great learning experience? I'm talking about a time when you were so engaged and excited by what you were learning that you couldn't wait to apply it to your own life. For me, this was often seeing a really interesting clinical case in medicine or figuring out a way to overcome a challenge in one of my businesses. Well, this is exactly what something called Kolb's learning theory is all about. It's a psychological model of learning that was developed by American educational psychologist David Kolb in the 1970s. And it's all about the emphasis on experience. Kolb believed that the best way to learn is by actively experiencing something and then reflecting on that experience in order to understand it more deeply. Kolb's learning theory is made up of two parts. The first part covers a four-stage cycle that follows the learning experience. According to Kolb, by going through the different stages, learners can convert their experiences into knowledge. The second part then focuses on learning preferences and the cognitive processes that occur for learners to acquire knowledge. The theory highlights how people demonstrate their understanding of topics when they're able to apply abstract concepts to new situations. So let's start by exploring the four stages of learning, referred to as the experiential learning cycle. Active experiential learning is at the heart of Kolb's learning theory. The idea is that you need to transform abstract concepts into something meaningful in order to learn. For example, Gleason scoring in medicine is fairly abstract when learned from a textbook, but becomes much more meaningful when you need to use it to explain a management plan to a patient newly diagnosed with prostate cancer. As such, memorization doesn't equal learning, because memorization doesn't improve our understanding of the topic that we're revising. And as a result, we've not gained any additional value. The four-stage experiential learning cycle views learning as an integrated process. All four stages are mutually supportive because Kolb believes that effective learning is a cyclical process that involves experiencing, reflecting, thinking, and then acting. Kolb's experiential learning cycle highlights how learners change as a result of experience, reflection, conceptualization, and then experimentation. Now, according to the cycle, learning occurs when an individual comes across an experience and reflects upon it. This leads to analysis and formulation of abstract concepts. Learners can then experiment with these hypotheses in various situations. So let's look at each step a little bit closer. Concrete experience is the first stage of Kolb's learning theory. This is where you actually experience something for yourself. This could be anything from reading a book to performing part of an operation in surgery. The key here is to immerse yourself in the experience and take in as much as you can, paying close attention to what you're doing. Now, it sounds obvious, but the key here is actually putting yourself into the learning opportunity in the first place. Most people won't push themselves, as it's much more comfortable learning theory or sitting things out. The times when I've learned the most are when I've challenged myself to do something way outside of my comfort zone. For example, I didn't really want to start this YouTube channel, but by jumping in and committing to posting a video every Sunday, I've learned a huge amount in a short space of time. I could have put things off by reading the best way to film or do tons and tons of research, but I knew that executing quickly and jumping into a learning experience is the best way to learn. The second stage of Kolb's learning theory is then reflective observation. This is where you take some time to think about what you've just experienced. You might ask yourself questions like, what did I learn from this experience? Or how did this experience make me feel? This is a crucial step in the learning process because it helps you to make connections and understand what you've experienced on a much deeper level. By taking the time to reflect on your experiences, you're able to see them from different angles and gain a much more well-rounded understanding of what you've just learned. When I trained as a surgeon, I would routinely reflect on every operation, and when writing the operation note, I'd also jot down some reflective learning points and play things back over again in my mind. I'd also discuss things with the supervising surgeon to maximise the learning opportunity. Now, whatever you're learning, whether studying for a written exam or learning something practical, committing to regular self-reflection and coaching will help you to learn much faster. The third stage of Kolb's learning theory is abstract conceptualization. This is where you start to put what you've learned into more general terms. You might create a concept or theory to explain what you've just learned. This is where you start to see the big picture and make connections between different ideas. For example, let's say you've just learned about a new concept in math. You might take some time to reflect on what you've learned and then come up with a general rule or formula that explains how that concept works in your own terms. This is abstract conceptualization in action. The final stage of Kolb's learning theory is then active experimentation. This is where you take what you've learned and apply it to your own life. You might try out a new skill or approach, or even just think about a problem in a different way. This is where the real learning happens, because you're taking what you've learned and using it to make a difference in your own life. For example, let's say you've just learned a new way to solve a math problem. In the active experimentation stage, you might try out that new approach on a few different problems to see how well it works. This is a great way to test your understanding of the concept and see how it applies in real-world situations. If you're learning how to improve your confidence, you might try maintaining eye contact for longer during a conversation to see how it feels and then what happens. Now, even though concrete experiences are at the top of the learning cycle, you can enter it at any stage and follow it all the way round. However, as each stage is dependent on the others, learners must complete all stages to develop new knowledge. In fact, according to Kolb, no one stage of the cycle is effective on its own. Instead, learners must complete all 4 stages of experiencing, reflecting, thinking, and acting to develop new knowledge. And with each experience, learners are able to integrate their new observations with their current understanding. This cycle of learning from experience is very similar to the work of author Joseph Campbell and his book The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which analyses how heroes and stories take the reader on their own journey of learning. If we think about any hero, from Harry Potter to Frodo or Luke Skywalker, they start their journey by taking action. They encounter obstacles before reflecting, and then they internalize the experience, and then the journey changes them. Now, while this usually takes the hero a few hours in a film or a book, for regular humans, this is a continuous cycle over our entire lifetime. And experiential learning is a continuous journey, where you encounter challenges which you learn from and gradually get better and better at whatever it is you're learning, whether that's mastering the Force or becoming a wizard. This hero's journey involves not just reflecting, but also applying learning points into practice. And this is where having a growth mindset is so important. A lot of the concrete experiences that I've learned the most from have actually been failures. Whether it's getting an active recall question wrong when studying for an exam, losing a race, or missing a business target, by reflecting and then improving, I've learned things way faster than when things have gone smoothly. And this is because we're more likely to dissect things when they go wrong. We naturally want to improve, but sometimes we need to get past that pain of failure and have that growth mindset where every failure is a learning experience. So what makes experiential learning theory so effective, and why do so many people find it to be a valuable model of learning? Well, one of the key strengths of Kolb's learning theory is that it recognizes that everybody learns slightly differently. Kolb extended his original learning cycle in 1984 and introduced a model about different learning preferences to explore learners' inner cognitive processes based on the original 4-stage learning cycle. While the original 4 stages of the learning cycle work together to create a learning process, some people prefer certain stages over others. For example, I probably spend a little bit more time on concrete experience and active experimentation than on the other stages. Now, according to Kolb, our learning preference is actually the result of 2 pairs of variables. This can be seen as 2 separate choices that we make. Kolb represents each stage of the learning cycle along 2 intersecting axes. The horizontal axis sits between active experimentation and reflective observation, and this is called the processing continuum, and it's basically how we approach a task. The vertical axis, on the other hand, sits between concrete experience and abstract conceptualization, and is known as the perception continuum, and this is how we think or feel about a task. The processing continuum focuses on how we approach a task, and on this continuum we choose how to grasp the information, and this can be done through doing or through watching. The perception continuum, on the other hand, describes our emotional response or how we make information meaningful. We choose a way to transform and process our experiences. This can be through feeling or through thinking. Now, Kolb believed that we can't both think and feel about an experience at the same time, and our learning preference is a product of which we choose to focus on. If we look at this as a 2x2 matrix, we can see that each learning preference represents a combination of two preferred preferences. The matrix also highlights Kolb's terminology for the four learning preferences: diverging, assimilating, and then converging and accommodating. So let's now look at the four experiential learning preferences and see which one you relate to the most. By figuring out your own experiential learning preference, Kolb believed that you can get the most out of whatever experiences you have and learn faster and more effectively. First up is diverging, and this focuses on exploring ideas and possibilities. People who are diverging learners see things from different perspectives and can use their imagination to show creativity in their learning preference. People with a diverging preference prefer to watch rather than do, and their learning characteristic is reflective observation and concrete experience. Kolb called this preference diverging because people with this preference are better at coming up with ideas in situations like brainstorming. Diverging preference people like to work in groups, listen with an open mind, and get personal feedback. The assimilating learning preference focuses on understanding and organising information. Assimilating learners enjoy reflective observation and abstract conceptualization. This learning preference prefers a good, clear explanation rather than just doing something. People with this preference are very good at understanding a lot of different kinds of information and putting it all together in a clear and logical way. People who learn by assimilating care more about ideas and abstract concepts. And people with this preference are more interested in theories that make logical sense than in ideas that are useful in the real world. People with this type of learning preference like reading, lectures, exploring analytical models, and having time to think things through when they're learning in a formal setting. It's a learning preference often seen in scientists and anyone working with lots and lots of data. The final learning preference is then accommodating, and this is focused on learning through hands-on experience and experimentation, and this is probably my preferred learning preference, with an emphasis on active experimentation and concrete learning. It's hands-on and relies more on intuition than on logic. These people like to take a practical hands-on approach and analyze later. They like to take on new challenges, try new things, and follow through on plans to execute them. Now, one key point I want to make here is that you might hear people talking about learning styles when talking about Kolb learning. I've deliberately used the term learning preference here. That's because there's no evidence that accommodating learning methods for people's learning preferences leads to better learning. Paschler et al. In 2008 conducted a meta-analysis on the learning styles literature, which highlighted the lack of correlation between people's learning preference and more effective learning. There's a big underlying assumption here that if we follow our learning preferences, then that's a good thing. But this isn't necessarily the case. People have food preferences too. Salty, sweet, fatty, or a combination of all three. We love salted caramel ice cream, right? If we always ate our favourite food, we'd be unhealthy though. And learning is exactly the same. Yes, people have learning preferences, however, following these preferences doesn't necessarily lead to better learning. The style of learning has very little impact on how effectively we learn. We're better off asking ourselves what the best learning methods are based on what needs to be learned. For example, learning how to play tennis requires a very different method than learning how to manage a team of salespeople. We should also ask ourselves where we are in the learning process. For example, how much prior knowledge do we have? Experts in an area need a very different kind of instruction than novices do. And finally, we want to ask ourselves what the specific needs on the learner are, such as accessibility needs, language needs, and the type of devices and technology that are being used. One of the strengths of Kolb's learning theory is that it's very flexible. Unlike some other learning theories which are very prescriptive and specific, Kolb's learning theory is more of a framework than a set of rigid rules. This means that you can adapt and modify the theory to fit your own learning preference and needs. For example, you might decide to focus on one stage of the learning process more than others. This flexibility of experiential learning theory allows you to tailor your learning experience to fit your own needs and preferences, which can make learning more effective and enjoyable. So now you know a little bit more about experiential learning theory, what do you think? I'd love to know more down below in the comments. I'll also pop up a link to the evidence-based learning series, which is worth diving into for some more research-backed learning and studying tips. So that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you so much for watching. Do hit that subscribe button for more videos like this every Sunday, and I'll catch you again in the next one.